Hey there, my name is Drew Brashler, and in this video, I want to show you how to set up a redundant drive snake from your front of house to back house where you have your SoundGrid I/O sitting. Now, if you're brand new to my channel, I'm all about helping you feel more confident with your production gear no matter where you're starting from. Also, if you are on a path wanting to learn more about audio engineering and recording and tips and tricks, I have a weekly newsletter over at audiotoolkit.co that you can go and sign up for free and get some of my favorite tips and tricks right into your inbox for free. So head over there and check it out. But let's actually dive in and see how we can get a redundant SoundGrid network set up. Now, with SoundGrid, there is not a redundant network that you can actually set up with a stage box like the Ionic 24 and your LV1 and have there be redundancy like a primary and a secondary network like Dante. But what you can end up doing with some network switches is setting up a thing called a lag group or a link aggregated group, which then you can have two sends from your switch sitting at front of house where we have our LV1 Classic, and then an identical switch sitting at back of house where you have all of your I/O. And those two lines can end up being a primary and a redundant. And if one of those lines gets disconnected or broken, then the other one will just go ahead and pick up with the rest of the audio. So in essence, we do have a redundant drive snake, if you will, from our front of house to back of house when we get this thing set up. So I have some diagrams that I want to talk about with network switches and SoundGrid, as well as some setup that I'm using on some D-Link switches. So I have two of the D-Link DGS-1210-10Ps, and those are the network switches that I'm using for this demo, in essence. So when we're talking about network switches with SoundGrid, there's a few things that I want to say about that. First, you do need to use a SoundGrid approved switch. And Waves has a bunch of articles showing you what switches are actually approved for using with SoundGrid. And there's a couple things that you need to note. One is using a gigabit or 1000 base T network switch. And that is important because if you're using a less quality switch, then it's not going to be able to keep up with this SoundGrid network. The other thing that we want to make sure is that SoundGrid is its own exclusive network, meaning that we're not sharing data from our computer to the internet on this same network. So SoundGrid does need to be a closed network isolated by itself. So if you have other network traffic that you need to pass, you need to have a separate network for that. The other thing that we need to do is disable energy efficient Ethernet or EEE. Now this is a thing that messes with SoundGrid, and this is also a thing that messes with Dante. So really with any production switch, we should not have this turned on. The reason that we have it is for saving power in very large buildings that have lots of switches and lots of ports and maybe computers that just shut off and aren't used for a long time. EEE basically disables the amount of power going through that switch and that network port so we can save more on energy. So in a large, building, it might be a good idea, but for a production environment, it is not a good idea to have turned on. In fact, and actually any SoundGrid device that we have from Waves has this EEE turned off. And for EEE, or this energy efficient Ethernet, to actually function, you need to have both the switch and the receiving device have that turned on for it to actually initiate. Now, this can become a problem when you have multiple switches in a network that all have EEE turned on. And this is going to be some of those passive, unmanaged switches. So I always use managed switches when I can. And again, we want to be using the recommended SoundGrid compatible switches, which I have linked down in the description below for Waves with their switch info. Now, this is a pretty simple SoundGrid setup. Now, on the back of the LV1 Classic, we have 4 SoundGrid network ports, and we can use those for connecting other SoundGrid servers. We can use that for connecting to other network switches for our SoundGrid network, or we can do I/O through that. So there are 4. So in most situations, you might not even have to add a network switch. But if you have a more complicated network that has more SoundGrid devices than just those 4, then we can go ahead and add a network switch to our SoundGrid network. And so here we go. I have added this single front of house switch. Now with this front of house switch, I'm going to have this very short between my LV1 Classic and the network switch. And my recommendation would be less than 10 meters or 32 feet. And then the other requirement is that any other servers that are added also have to be under 10 meters of network cable length between them and this network switch. Now for I/O, we can go all the way up to 100 meters or 328 feet for connecting other I/O devices. So like the Ionic 24 or the Ionic 16. We can just run a 100-meter network cable all the way to our I/O. But what if we want to have a little bit longer of a length? Maybe the 328 feet isn't long enough for getting to our I/O. Well, then we can use fiber. And so with our fiber, we then are starting to jump into managed network switches. And so there's a few things that I want to mention about managed network switches. One is, again, using a 1 gigabit per second network switch of a high quality brand. And we do need to retain an exclusive network or an isolated VLAN for our SoundGrid setup. And then another is having this EEE disabled. Again, this happens to be an issue when you have multiple switches that are connected together, in which case, if we're setting up with fiber, we would need that. And then the very last thing is SoundGrid is an IPv6 protocol. It does not need any IPv4 things. So any layer 3 features on your network switch, you should turn off. So quality of service, multicast, DHCP, all of these things we should turn off on that SoundGrid network switch so that this gives the best results for your SoundGrid network on this managed switch. Okay, so back to this. This is our simple setup. We have our front of house switch, we have our SoundGrid server, our LV1 Classic, and this 100 meters between our I/O and this network switch. Now, if I was wanting to increase this length, what I could do is I could add 2 network switches instead of just 1, and then I could use a fiber line between my 2 network switches. So we can see I have a front of house switch, and that is connected with my LV1 and my SoundGrid server that's extra. And then I have this LC fiber going between my front of house switch and my back of house switch, and then I can then go and connect my I/O to my back of house switch. So this is pretty simple. And we can go up to 550 meters with multi-mode fiber of our 50/125 and up to 275 meters with this other multi-mode fiber. Now, this is where we start talking about the lag group. Now, with this setup that I have of a single fiber, if someone rolled a cart across that fiber, then we could lose our fiber connection between front of house and back of house. Or if someone stepped on it or bent it really hard, that sort of thing. So fiber is a little bit delicate, and that's why we always want to be using armored fiber that is made for touring. But with this lag group, what we can end up doing is having 2 fiber lines going between our front of house switch and our back of house switch. And then the network switch can then use both of those lines as a primary and redundant so that if one of those network lines either becomes disconnected or broken, it will pick up on the other line like nothing happened. And so this is what I'm going to show you guys today. So now with the link aggregated group, I have my 2 lines going between my front of house switch and my back of house switch, and I actually have that running right now. And so I have these 2 D-Link switches, and I have these 2 lines are my trunk ports, and those are going between my front of house switch and my back of house switch. My SoundGrid network is on its own isolated VLAN here, and I have actually made this working with Dante being on a second VLAN. So I have another video that I'm going to be doing explaining that. And that's actually one of the reasons that I picked this specific switch, because it is both Dante compatible and SoundGrid compatible, which is fantastic. Okay, so with the lag, what I can end up doing is disconnecting one of the lines, and I can show you that we don't lose any audio. So a few errors will appear here when we do have that disconnection, but we won't actually lose audio completely. So let's hear here. Okay, so here I have some audio. We have some pink noise going, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to disconnect one of my network lines here. So here is my primary line that I'm going to disconnect. Now I have this disconnected, and my phone is still going with my pink noise, and we have noticed that we didn't lose any audio when that drop happened. There are a few errors here that happened when we did disconnect this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plug this back in, and we'll also notice that we won't lose any audio, but the error count will increase while it is trying to reconnect our cables here. Okay, and so now I'm going to go ahead and plug this back in. Give this a second to go ahead and get back connected, so we can see that we had a couple more errors add in, but we didn't lose any of our audio. And so now that that is connected back up, I can go ahead and disconnect my backup line, and we can see that we didn't lose any audio. And that's the beauty of this lag connection that we have, these trunk lines. Now, when we're setting this up, there's a few things that we need to do. First, we need to set up a VLAN for it. And so I'm going to show you just an overview of this and then show you some of my settings that I had inside of these two network switches to get this actually working. And so we have two VLANs here. Now, a VLAN is a virtual network inside of a network switch. It's almost like saying this 8 ports, I'm taking a couple of these ports and isolating it as its own network. And then that can then be sent to other things. And so this VLAN allows us to have SoundGrid be its own isolated exclusive network, which is one of the requirements that SoundGrid has. And then we can actually share this network switch with other things. Now, I say that with a caveat. You do need to be careful on switch load, because if you overload your switch, then it's not going to be the best type of situation. So if you're also trying to use the same network switch for, say, ArtNet or some lighting protocols along with Dante, along with this, then you're probably going to end up overloading your switch, which I have seen in some installations with just Dante and ArtNet being on the same network switch, and it crashed the switch. So make sure you do test these things before you actually run it in, in the actual world at a show. But in this case, I had this running for about 48 hours with a stress test with audio going at 96K, and I had no issues with Dante also going at 96K as well. So this is a great, robust network switch. Now with this VLAN, we have our default network, and that's going to be a VLAN 1. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a SoundGrid VLAN and call that VLAN 10. Now, when we're setting up our SoundGrid switch here, we have our ports 1 through 7 as SoundGrid, and those are going to be on VLAN 10. Now, I'm having this set as an untagged network, meaning that the network data that's going into this port is not tagged with a VLAN, which is important because we want anything that we plug into these network switches on these network ports to just work on SoundGrid. We don't want to have to worry about tagged traffic. And so that's why we have it untagged for VLAN 10. Now, my switch management on port 8 is going to be untagged for VLAN 1, which is where my management is. Now, then the other thing that we have is this PVID, or a port ID. Now, this needs to match what VLAN you have it set to. So in which case, for my SoundGrid network being on VLAN 10, I need to set this port VID to be on 10 as well. And then for my other ports, my management and then my trunk lines, those are going to be on PVID 1. Now with my trunk lines, I am actually wanting to tag the traffic from both my VLAN 1 and my VLAN 10. Now I picked VLAN 10 just because I love the number 10. So you can pick any number that you want as long as it's the same for all the rest of the network switches that you set up. So just keep that in mind. But with this trunk line, I am tagging any traffic from VLAN 1 as tagged traffic for VLAN 1. That tells the trunk line, hey, this needs to be set for VLAN 1, and then we're tagging our SoundGrid traffic on 10, and that's saying that to our trunk lines, hey, this is VLAN 10 tagged traffic. So then that's going to send it out to our other trunk line that's on the other network switch. And then the other network switch will need its own dedicated IP address for that. So I have this one set up as IP address of 192.168.13.250 and 251. And we can see that when I show you my setup here. But on the same network switch that's on the other side, we would end up doing this same thing on that line. Now, one thing to mention about the lag group, or the link aggregated group, there's two settings that we need to test. And it's best to test it with your specific switch and choose which one you find is better in your situation. So for me, I ended up choosing the LACP. When I tested the static, when I did disconnect it, the error count here that we see on our LV1 was significantly higher. And so I chose the LACP because that had the least amount of errors for me when I did disconnect one of those lines. Okay, so let's actually see my network switches that I have here. So I have my two network switches, and so we can see that this is 250, and this is my back of house switch. And then on my other switch, this is 251, and this is my front of house switch. So with my front of house switch, let's go ahead and check out how I have the VLAN set up. Now for this specific D-Link, this is the DGS-1210-10P. This is going to be different than your specific switch. So you will need to know a little bit of networking on how to actually program your switch, which there's going to be a bunch of YouTube videos out there for you to be able to search on your specific switch if you have a different switch than I do. So with our VLAN, what we want to do is we want to go and create VLANs. So on my network switch, I have set up a few VLANs. So we have a default, I have my SoundGrid VLAN, and then this specific switch, I also have a Dante primary VLAN that I did set up, which is going to be a different video. But when I have my VLAN 1, which is my default line, we can see that my port 8 is set as untagged, and that I have tagged the traffic for VLAN 1 on port 9 and 10, which is going to be those optical transceivers. Now, if we go back to our VLAN here, we can go click into SoundGrid, and I can see that I have it set on untagged traffic for 1, 2, and 3. Now, if I was wanting to include the 4 through 7, all I would do is go and click these as untagged, and then I can save that, and then I have to remove those from the other ports that I have set for Dante primary, which if we go look on Dante primary, I have these set as untagged traffic for 4 through 7. But in this case, for our SoundGrid, we would want to have all of those ports that we want for SoundGrid set for untagged. And then for our trunk ports, 9 and 10, I have those set as tagged. Now, the next thing that we do once we apply that, then we want to go over to our VLAN PVID. And this is where we set that PVID for the specific ports. And so that's telling that specific port, this is what we need to be programmed as. So we can see on my 1 through 3, that's PVID 10, there's 10, there's 10. And then with my Dante, I had that set as VLAN 20, so I have those set like that. And then for my 8, which is my management port, and then my 9 and 10, which is my trunk ports, I have those set as 1. Now then the other thing that I want to do is down in quality of service, or QoS, I'm wanting to do port-based QoS. Now, this is allowing me to create some sort of priority service for the ports that are important, in which case, SoundGrid and my trunk lines are the most important. My management port is not as important. And then my Dante, I'm actually going to set one level below for this port priority. And so right here, we can see my port 1 through 3 is all set to priority of 7. So what I would do is I would just go select from port 1 to 3 is priority 7. Or if we were setting this up, port 1 through 7 as SoundGrid, then I'd go ahead and set 1 through 7 as priority 7. And then the lower this number on this specific switch, the less priority there is for quality of service or switching priority. And so for my management port on 8, I have set that to 5. We can see that 6 is for my Dante ports that I set up on the switch. And then for my trunk ports on 9 and 10, I have those set as 7. And so then the next thing that we need to do is we need to create this same setup on our back of house switch. So you would set your SoundGrid ports to be that VLAN 10. You would set the same tagging, the same untagging for your untagged ports for the SoundGrid ports, and then tagging them on our trunk ports. And so if we go and check out my other switch that I have, we can see that in my VLAN, I have my SoundGrid on 1 through 3. And then on my VLAN 1 as default, I have those untagged through 8 through 10 here. And so for on the other network switch, we would need to create some identical setups here. So we would need to create that VLAN 10 for our SoundGrid ports. And then we would also need to set up our tagged trunk lines for our 9 and 10. Now then the other thing that we need to do once we have that set up for both of our network switches is we need to actually activate our lag group or our link aggregated group. And so that is going to be in our L2 functions, and under link aggregation, we can go to port trunking, and I am going to enable this on our specific D-Link device. And then once we have that enabled, then we can go and tag our 9 and 10 as a group together. So I just go and select 9 and 10, press apply, and then those create a lag group. And then we would do that same thing on our other switch. And then we can go ahead and connect those together and get that working. Now then, the other thing that I suggest is going to your LACP port settings and then setting your 9 and 10 as a short timeout. And that's just going to give you the best possible settings that we have here. So I hope this video was helpful for you today, showing you how to get a redundant network set up with your front of house to back of house drive lines. Now remember, there isn't a way of actually doing a redundant network like you can with, say, Dante, where you have a Dante primary and a Dante secondary. There is no SoundGrid primary and SoundGrid secondary. It's all one network, which is great. And the robustness of the SoundGrid network has been fantastic in all of the shows that I have used the LV1 system on. So I haven't had any issues, knock on wood, that it never happens in the future. But by setting up this link aggregated group between my two network switches, I'm giving myself the most robust type of network setup where I have these two drive lines. Now, if you want to, you can definitely use Ethernet lines for your trunk lines. So if you have two Ethernet lines instead of fiber, you could definitely do the same sort of link aggregated group over networking lines rather than fiber. But in my case, fiber is going to be beneficial for me for if I need to have longer than a 100-meter length, which is important. Now, down in the description below, I have linked a couple articles that are important on the Waves side of things for setting up your network switches and your SoundGrid network. So you can check out some of those below. But I hope this video was helpful for you today. If you do happen to have any questions, or if there's a video that you're hoping that I would make on the LV1 system or any of the other production equipment that's out there, please post that in the comment section down below, as I'm always reading through those comments to find videos that are going to be helpful for you. If you haven't already, make sure to check out my website at drewbrashler.com. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day.